Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to our Kieran Clinic. The development committee thought this was a great idea to put on, and they were looking for some panelists to help out. So we have myself, the wonderful Taylor Crane, and Billy Rudnick are here to help us out and learn a little bit about Kieran's. To go kind of talk you through the agenda of what we're hoping to do tonight, we're going to go through, first off, given some of the events that happened in our membership meeting, we've kind of locked down our Zoom a little bit more. And thus, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat section. Jane Barr is doing a wonderful job moderating our chat. So any questions that pop up, she'll make sure they get directed towards us. So that's why everybody is kind of muted at this point in time. To give you an idea of what we're going to go through, there were some frequently asked questions about Kieran's that were put together, so we're going to discuss those first. It's going to be kind of talking about, what is a Kieran? How do I race a Kieran? How do I train for a Kieran? And then we're going to move into some video review and actually look at what it takes to race a Kieran from some of the videos from our live stream, as well as Lizanne Fox was nice enough to point us at her YouTube, so she has some Kieran videos up there. So we'll dive through those and see how we go. So Billy, do you want to kick us off with everything we need to know officially about the Kieran?
Okay, got me off unmute. Hi, I'm Billy Rudnick. I'm a competitor out at JBMV Velodrome, and I'm also an official. Basically, we're discussing today the JB Kieran, our version of the Kieran. One thing I will preface is that when you're out racing Kierans and you're at the track, make sure you're at the riders meeting, follow the instructions of the race director, the starter, and the chief referee. So whatever they say for that race that day is how those rules are going to be followed. But generally, the JB Kieran is a 4-lap race on our 400-meter track with about 6 to 8 riders to start. Generally, riders will start from a standing start position at the front pursuit line, but we adjusted that due to COVID considerations, and we found that the rolling start from the warm-up circle has been worked really well. Riders will draw for position generally prior to the race. Pre-COVID, we did that by you reaching in and get some poker chips for your position, 1 through 6, 1 through 7, 1 through 8. And then you would accordingly line up, you'd be behind the pacer on that position. With the COVID considerations, we now use a random number generator, which the officials generate the positions. The riders basically, when the start occurs, must remain in these positions for the first lap behind the pacer, but as you will see in the race book, for the JB Kieran, it's half lap. Again, follow the instructions of your starter and chief referee at the beginning of the race. The e-bike will normally start from the backstretch of the track, and it sets up in the sprint lane nearest the measurement line, will come around, and that's when they'll join onto the back of the pacer at the position that you got or assigned at the beginning, before the start of the race. If we were starting from a standing start, like we may do in the major championships, the starter will fire a shot when the e-bike's within 10 to 15 meters of the riders at the front pursuit line. The riders draft behind the e-bike for the first 2.5 laps. You gradually accelerate up to about 50 kilometers per hour, 31 miles an hour before the bike pacer departs on the backstretch at the pursuit line. Riders cannot pass the leading edge of the pacer before it exits the track at the rear pursuit line. Once the motor pulls off, then sprint rules apply. It's a 1.5 lap sprint to the line. And there you go. I think there was a question of how the start order is determined. Generally, in the past, we did seeding for the first event, the first preliminary heats. The officials would do that. Now we have seeding done ahead of time because the race registration is online. We can get all that done. And then the orders get assigned, as I mentioned, either if we do chip drawing because in the COVID pandemic or something passes, it allows us to do it, or we do it by a random number generator. And that's the baseline for starting this whole conversation.
Cool. All right. Thanks very much. So we covered the rules. I know that some of us also travel up to Burnaby, and I actually see some of our Burnaby folks online here, which is great to see them tuning in. And kind of the differences between the Kieran at Marymore and the Kieran at Burnaby is it's virtually the same, just you get a lap and a half on our track, which equates to roughly 600 and a bit meters, 620 meters. And then on the Burnaby Velodrome, they're pulling off at 3.5 to go, which is a little over 700 meters. And because the Burnaby track is so much tighter than the Marymore track, if you want to make a move from everything we're talking about, those moves have to happen much quicker because of just how much harder it is to overtake on that track. Taylor, you want to talk to us about the safety of the Keirin?
I guess there were questions about Keirins being dangerous, and I hear that a lot about track racing in general, and I kind of always have the same answer for that. I think racing on the track tends to be safer than other disciplines just because there are so many rules. The same with the Keirin. In a Keirin, there's a lot less people to worry about than a points race or a scratch race, something like that. And the first part, everyone for the most part is staying in line. It's pretty safe. You're pretty aware of who's around you. There's an element of danger to it, of course, but I think that when you're in that situation, like in a sprint, that you kind of have more focus and that makes you safer. That's my experience. Yes, it can be dangerous, and we often see those crashes in Keirins that are really dramatic just because the speeds are faster. But I think a majority of the time, it's just like any other race on the track and can be very safe.
And to tee off what Taylor was talking about, like, if we think back way to our welcome to the track intro class, we always talk about looking before we move sort of thing. And as long as you do that in a Keirin, it's just as safe as a scratch race or a points race, because as soon as you start moving without looking is where accidents happen, no matter what the track race is. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, or first off, are there any questions for anything we've talked about so far? We kind of covered a little bit of information very quickly, and we're going to start getting into some details. Jane, are we good here?
Yeah, I haven't seen any questions come through at the moment.
Cool. All right, so Keirins are generally taking place over multiple rounds. On a typical Friday night, we're just going to do a single heat and then into a final and a minor final. Generally, depending on the size of the field, we're going to do the best that we can to have max groups of 6. So in an 18-rider field, you'll see 3 heats of 6, and the top 2 will go to the major final, and 3 and 4 will go to the minor final. On a bigger event like the Marymore Grand Prix, you'll see heats, repêchages, semifinals, and then finals. So in that sense, similar to how a Friday night heat works, in the first round, usually 1 or 2 top qualifiers will make it directly through into the semifinals, and then everybody else will go into a repêchage where they'll get to race again. And then depending on the size of the field, a certain number of riders will be pulled out of those repêchage heats, and they move on to the semifinals. From the semifinals, there's going to be 2 rides. Top 3 in each ride go to finals, bottom 3 in each ride go to minor finals. And that's just how it is. And then finals play out exactly how you'd expect finals to play out. The major final is for 1 through 6, and the minor final is usually through 7 through 12. Let's talk a little bit about training. Taylor, you want to kick us off on training?
Yeah, so when Andrew and I were talking about this, we kind of decided to have me talk about kind of the low-level idea of training for a Keirin, and then Andrew will go into a little bit more detail about some specifics. I think something that's really important for the Keirin is getting used to that length of effort. So when you're training on the track, you're thinking maybe in a Keirin, maybe you're thinking it's going to be about a 1-lap effort. That's about 30 seconds. So you can go out and do flying laps on the track. Another really important thing in a Keirin, and in a lot of the videos that we'll show later, you'll see this happen, is a lot of acceleration when you have already accelerated. So you're up to maybe like 85% of your speed, and then you have to get out of your saddle and go to that 100%. And you may even see that happen a couple times in the race where someone is accelerating in the saddle, getting out of the saddle to get a bit more or to protect their position, and then they sit back down, continue that acceleration, and need to be able to get up again. That takes practice to be able to do, and so that's a really good thing that you can do on your own at the track without getting super specific. I mean, I'll do things where I do like a 1/2 lap seated acceleration, get out of the saddle for maybe part of the straightaway, sit down and kind of try and imagine like I'm in that Keirin round, because I think that's a really good way to, 1, start thinking about when you'd want to use your speed, and then 2, get used to that standing up when you're already at a higher cadence is hard to do. And so it's good to practice that. I think Andrew will go into a little bit more kind of nitty gritty about that, but that's kind of how I think of it. Whenever I'm training on the track, I'm trying to think about what I'm actually doing in the race and why I need to practice something.
Yeah, I think Taylor hit on a lot of really good points there. 30-second power is definitely key when it comes to Keirin. But on top of that, if you want to talk about where your peak power is going to be applied, unlike out of the standing start, where you're going to see that peak power and peak torque right around like 60 to 80 RPM, usually based on the gear you pick and the fact that you're already getting towed up to speed by a motorbike of some kind, you're looking really at being able to put out that maximum power, maybe around 100 or 110 RPM, and then accelerating from there. So some of the drills you can think about is if, like, say you and a training partner are out at the track, somebody can play the role of the bike or the first person and, so lead somebody up to speed and then practice jumping off and holding it for a half lap or even a full lap. Some great drills you can do. Cadence, or we like to think that in this world of really big gears, we've moved away from leg speed, but at the end of the day, leg speed still matters, and you still got to be able to put out the power and spin at 140 RPM when it counts. Let's address Andy's question real quick, because I think it plays very well into what we're talking right now, which is, kind of hips and elbows and throwing heads and things like that, very much old school or Japanese Keirin rules. And, even if you look at like the World Cup level stuff, they aren't doing that as much anymore. And Taylor, you had a really great comment on that the other day when we were chatting.
Yeah, we were talking about that when Andrew and I were kind of figuring out what we were doing for this. People used to ride a lot smaller gears, which made the sprints a little bit shorter. There was also a lot more jockeying around for position because you didn't have to stay in the same order behind the bike. With the sprint being shorter, there tended to be more like need for that to make sure that you got into the position that you wanted to be in. Now the race tends to be a little bit more drawn out, and that's in my opinion kind of wasted energy, that you are then too close to those people, so you don't have enough room, which we're going to really talk about later. You don't have enough room to move. You kind of just wasted your energy on that one person. So I think it just doesn't happen as much for lots of different reasons. You'll still see people doing that, but I think it's more for like the playing around fun of it than actually like tactically being a good idea to do in the moment.
Yeah. There was another question here that talking about how our scratch races and points race is not considered Keirin race. Is a Keirin race only a 4-lap race? And a Keirin race is specifically, it was a race started in Japan as post-war and post-World War II when they weren't allowed to gamble on horses. So they started betting on bicycle racing. And it's strictly, in this day and age of the rule book, pretty much half the race is spent behind the motorbike where they're getting paced up to speed. And then the second half of the race is just a full-on sprint. So you can definitely end up in like scratch race situations where maybe a breakaway is all together with five riders and maybe a lap and a half to go, and it plays out like the end of a Keirin. But generally the speeds in a Keirin are much higher because you don't have the fatigue of 30 previous laps of effort going into it. So it's really just an all-out top speed endurance sort of race. Jane, are there any training questions? Anybody have any training questions? See if we have any of those before we move on.
Yes, there is a question. Heather said yes, please. So I'm kind of waiting. There's a question.
Okay. And because I mentioned it at the all membership meeting, strength training is always good when you're talking about top level power, Andy Baker. You got to do it.
I'll kind of go back to something Andrew said, if you don't have somebody to train with you at the track, because yes, I agree, it'd be awesome. You have your partner kind of bring you up to speed and then you can practice that acceleration. You can also do that from diving down the track to get yourself up to speed without as much effort, because that takes away some of the load in your legs, because that's what you're trying to simulate with that partner bringing up to speed or the motor bringing you up to speed, to still be fresh when you're doing your sprint. So if you're coming like from the top of the track at maybe medium intensity, that's not taking a lot out of you, and then you dive down pretty aggressively down the banking, that gives you a lot of free speed, and then from there you could do your big acceleration in training. So there's lots of different ways you can do it, even if you don't have somebody to ride with.
Oh, and Heather's question is all about gear selection, which leads perfectly into our next topic that we wanted to cover, which is how do I choose my Keirin gear? Oh, wait, we have an Andy training question real quick. Is there a difference between how folks should train for a Keirin at our track on a Cat 1, 2, Cat 3, or women? I would say relatively no, because at the end of the day, it's still a 30-second top speed sprint or thereabouts. Taylor, do you have any comments on that?
I think that the races in the women field tend to play out a little differently sometimes, and come down to a little bit more acceleration than some of the men's races, just because the fields are smaller. That's kind of across the board. But I think that at the end of the day, if you have really good 30-second power and you can go hard, that's the priority. So the training should be pretty much the same. Your gear selection or how you race the race might be different in those categories, but I think overall the training should be the same.
Lee had a great question about if we're worried about the gym due to COVID concerns, what can we do on the bike to get some good strength work going on? First, building a garage gym is always an acceptable solution, but understanding that might not be financially viable for everybody. Big gear work is always great, especially where we live in the Pacific Northwest. If you can find a nice quiet hill and mash a big gear up a hill, that's fantastic. If you're going to be riding your track bike outside, we should always say that you should be sure you have some sort of braking system on it such that you are able to slow down and stop without the use of just your legs, because you might gas them from doing efforts. So make sure you are safe if you are taking your track bike out on the road. But I've also done things of, putting on a big gear, doing a standing start up a hill and then turning around once I run out of gas and then backpedaling my way down the hill to get that same sort of eccentric, concentric motion or leg fatigue that you would get in like a squat workout.
I also like stuff on my road bike of different lengths, kind of depending, because then you can have a lot of control over the RPM that you're at based on the gear, the hill, also a little less sketchy descending on your road bike than on the track bike. And then once you can get on the track, I think riding bigger gears in training, not necessarily to race, because you don't just necessarily go faster because you put a bigger gear on your bike, right? Like you have to still be able to pedal it fast. Andrew mentioned that earlier. I think a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to do a Keirin, I need to just put a really big gear on, I'm going to go fast. You still have to be able to pedal that gear fast, but I think it is very beneficial to train in bigger gears so that you're getting that strength. And for a lot of people, it's actually better to do that on the bike than in the gym, especially if you don't have a lot of gym experience, because then you're really directly working the muscles that you're going to use in a sprint on the bike.
Yeah, Keith brought up a great point of, watt bikes, although a bit on the more expensive side. Le Mans trainers you can generally find on eBay for a couple $100. They are great. There's a local guy, Blaine. He makes his company Sasquatch Legs, I think, makes the a Le Mans trainer adapter. And if not, the Velobike guy, Glenn, he's made a lot of really good adapters for a whole bunch of smart trainers. So, like I have a Wahoo, I don't have the adapter for it, but you can get a Wahoo adapter and crank that resistance mode up to like 90 or 95 and, go power away on that. And that'll get you plenty of leg strength, or at least really hurt yourself for a little bit. Let's get going on or you're saying I can buy a 65 tooth chainring instead of a gym membership. What a deal. As long as you make sure you partner that with a 12 or an 11 tooth cog, Andy, I think you're on a great track right there.
Pedal more than like 5 RPM.
Yeah, there you go. Get with the BMX one with like the 8 tooth sprocket, really go for it. But let's talk more about gear selection.
Yeah, so again, we're going to kind of do the low level, high level. You can get really nitty gritty about what gears you ride, obviously. I think for most people on a Friday night, that if you're maybe consider yourself more of a mass start racer, and we have a Keirin nights, going 2 to 6 inches bigger than what you typically ride in a scratch race is a good bet. Remember, you're getting pulled up to speed, so you don't have the load of that in your legs. It's nice to have a little bit more gear, but like I just was talking about, putting that bigger gear on doesn't make you magically go faster if you've never ridden in that gear. So I think it's really important to train in it. It also kind of depends between, the qualifying and the finals sometimes. and the people that are in the race, you know, one night might be all the fastest people in your category show up. And so that, you know, that's the day you might put a bigger gear on. Or maybe, you know, you're the fastest person and you're thinking that you might have to lead it out. You might not want to be in your biggest gear because that's not going to be your strength. So there are a lot of things that go into it, but kind of a general rule of thumb, go a little bit bigger than you would ride a scratch race. And make sure that it is something that you feel comfortable accelerating from.
And then if we want to get really into the nitty gritty, you know, there's a lot of really good like apps out there that tell you like gear inches and what speed you're going at certain RPMs. Matty Hertz from our track has made one for iOS. We'll just plug that because he's one of somebody in our community. And so essentially one way to think about it is, you know, generally you can put out peak power around 100 RPM. You know, and we all know the speed the bike is supposed to pull off at. Sometimes it's a little faster, sometimes it's a little slower, but I believe it's 50K for the men and 45K for the women. So we know what those numbers are. So we can pull up one of our fancy gear calculators and you can slide, I forget what Matty's is called, but it's like Track Gear Calc or something like that, I think is what it is. I'll post it in the Facebook event after that. I'll share it there. So that'll be a good way to go find it. Oh, Tyler has it as Gear Calc. So essentially you can say, okay, well, I know we're going to be dropped off at this speed. I know that I accelerate really well at say 95, 100, 105 RPM. So I can drag that RPM mode and start playing around with gears and say, well, what's going to be, where do I think the jump's going to happen and at what speed? So that way I know, okay, well, if I think it's going to be drop off at this speed and I want to accelerate, then I can say, oh, this is the gear that'll give me the best results. The other way you can go for it is like, what is the biggest gear that I know I can hit my top speed? As Taylor mentioned, you know, putting on a big gear isn't always the best way to succeed. If you can put on a 120-inch gear in your bag, but you can't get it up to your top speed, there is no point in putting it on. So, you know, what speed do you think it's going to be able to work on or to do? Shouldn't I put 125-inch and let my inner Karlberg take the wheel? Yeah, that's if you can move the 125-inch gear, that's definitely an option. But also keep in mind the bigger gear you put on, the most likely slower you are going to accelerate. So then that move that you're making at some point in time in the race is being even more telegraphed because you can't snap it. So there isn't a golden gear of like, oh yeah, just put on a 112 and you'll clearly be the best. You know, everything has its trade-offs. You can put on a really big gear, maybe you'll be able to go faster, but then it's going to take a little bit longer to get up to speed. You can put on a little bit smaller gear and it's going to be quicker to get up to speed, but maybe you don't have that same top end as if you go 1 or 2 or 4 inches bigger. So there's always going to be a trade-off on what gear you pick.
And you can try different things, right? So I think it's a lot about experimenting and maybe having some sort of way to track how you're doing that. Like, okay, I'm just going to try a bigger gear every single time, and you're going to reach a point of no return where it's like, okay, well, that was terrible, right? But you also have to think about when you put these gears on your bike, how you're going to race the race, kind of what Andrew's alluding to, right? Like you could put a really big gear on your bike. You need to know how long it's going to take you to get up to speed. Or if you have a small gear on your bike, you need to be a little bit more patient or time when you go differently. And so it's a lot about kind of how you make your plan. And I really think, and I stand by this a lot of times, that we get so nitpicky between like 1 gear inch. And yes, it does make a difference. But if someone else put the gear on your bike and you did not know what gear it was, a majority of the time you're going to be fine, right? Like you're going to still be able to race. You're still going to have a successful race of some sort, right? But we get so worried about this like tiny little detail that, you know, maybe it doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah. I think we've talked a lot about gearing. Any last gearing questions before we move on to the next topic? Lizanne's happy in a 106. Andy likes the 110, 112. Bigger gears, remember, only those who have gone too far know how far they can go. Yeah, that's not wrong. So how should we approach our kierans, Taylor?
How should we approach it? Okay, sorry, getting the notes. One of the things that we're talking about is that a lot of people, especially at our track, will be kind of like, it's a Keirin night, like I'm not gonna do good, this ruins my chance for the Omnium. And you kind of go into the race with this like very defeated attitude, like I'm not a sprinter, I'm not gonna do very good. Both Andrew and I would argue that our track especially is a really good track for anyone to do well in a Keirin. You have to race to your strengths. But if you go into any race, right, like this is good life advice. Like if you go in already saying you're going to do a bad job, you're probably going to do a bad job, right? So going into it with a little bit more confidence. And I think we'll kind of go into it a little bit more with how to race each position. But I think the key thing with that is having a plan, because I think a lot of people are like, oh, it's a Keirin, I don't like Keirins, I'm not good at them, I'm just gonna like go out there, right? And then you're not even trying to do anything. And so then you're just kind of like, maybe you'll get lucky, maybe you won't, just how the race shakes out. I think that everyone should go into it with at least like one thing that they want to accomplish in that race. And it might work and get you through to the next round, or maybe it doesn't, but at least you have like something that you're trying to do, which makes it a much more productive race than just kind of like, okay, I just have to do this race because it's here tonight, right?
Yeah. And I think coming up with a plan is such a big thing, because, you know, sometimes if you think about what like, at least for my average plan for a scratch race, you know, everybody generally knows is I'm going to wait around for the final sprint. But then on top of that, like I'm always looking to see what breakaways might happen, if there's a move I need to follow. And you can kind of go into a scratch race with a very relaxed plan of like, well, I'm going to follow some wheels. If these people go, I'll try to bridge. If there's a breakaway around this point in time, I might try to bridge into it. And that's kind of a very good generic scratch race plan. However, as we've talked about with the Keirins, it's generally a race up to top speed. And because there's no 30 laps preceding it, everybody's fresh. So if you go into a Keirin thinking, well, I'm just going to see what happens, you're probably going to be on the back foot by the time everybody gets up to speed. And when we get into video review later in this thing, we'll see some of that, of some people who hesitated, waited around, and then everybody just went. And even though they might have been on the right gear, if everybody else is already doing 35 miles an hour and you can only do 35 miles an hour, you're not going to come around anybody, let alone having to go high and around. So like, at least for me, I like to think of coming up with two plans. Essentially is plan A is, where do I want to jump on the track? Like, how are my legs feeling tonight? Do I want to go, who else is in my heat? Do I want to go long? Do I want to try to make it a shorter sprint? And so that's a great like plan A of what's the best for me in my position with who's in my race. Plan B is, what happens if something happens before I can execute my plan? If I'm in the front and somebody starts to come over the top, what am I going to do? If I'm in the back and I see people start to accelerate, what am I going to do? So having those two sorts of like, here's my A plan, but then if things start to happen before then, what am I going to do? I find is a great way to really approach the racing out here.
One more thing, I was going to say one more thing to that. I feel like with the defeating attitude going into it, I think it's always better to make people have to come around you. So I think a lot of people are like, I'm not good at Keirins, I don't want to be near the front, I'm just going to come around people. But it's kind of like what Andrew just said. If you're not a sprinter and your top end speed is maybe like a couple miles per hour slower than the sprinter in your group, you're not going to come around them, right? Like it's better to make them have to go through traffic to come around you. So taking that gamble, I think Keith said it in the chat too, that like anything can happen in a Keirin. Somebody's like, oh, you're the skinny roadie, I'm not going to pay attention to you. And then they're messing around with each other behind, right? And then that person is off the front and ends up winning, right? So don't go into it thinking that you're not going to do well. Go into it like anything can happen.
And the one video we really can't show that we want to show that really sums up anything can happen is the gold medal round from the Tokyo Olympics. If you haven't seen it, go see it. But essentially, Jason Kenny really hadn't been anywhere that entire Olympic Games. He was definitely not on his best form, and he drew number one on the motor. And right before the motor pulled off, Matthew Gleitzer in second wheel decided to back way off, gave Jason Kenny a 30-meter gap, and Kenny said, okay, and just rode away from everybody else because they were all looking at each other, and he ended up winning gold. So, you know, that's great if that happens. Andy, when I see people bail at the front of our track, what's up with that? Oh, we're definitely gonna talk about that when we get into some of the video review. So let's talk a little bit about how to race each position. Taylor, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so I think Andrew will go into some detail about the specific positions, but something that I think is really important that I don't see happening a lot at our track is people giving a little bit of room when they're behind the motor or behind the line, like in line after the e-bike, the motor pulls off, because you need that room to work with. So wherever you are in the line, you should kind of know who's behind you, who's in front of you, and adjust that space accordingly. But you never want to be right on the wheel of the person in front of you, because then if someone comes from behind you, you kind of get stuck there. You'll see it in some of the videos we watch later. You might have had that happen to you. It's very common. If you're right on the wheel in front of you, if someone comes up next to you, you're just stuck there. You may be faster, but unless you're really able to like push your way out, which a lot of times it isn't possible, you're stuck there. But if you have that little bit of space and you're riding maybe up on the outer edge of the sprinter's lane a little bit, have a little bit of space, you start feeling someone coming behind you, you have room to move out. That doesn't mean you have to go to the front, but it means that you have that escape. So I think that's very important. If I am on the motor, so if I drew number one, I like to actually relax a little bit for a second, because it's like, okay, I'm here, I'm on the bike. Odds of, and maybe we're going to talk about this too, but odds of someone coming and like stealing the motor from me are pretty slim. So I usually give myself like a little bit of a chill, like take a big deep breath, check behind me, make sure that nothing has like really shuffled up behind me. And then as it's getting close to time for the bike to pull off, I'm actually going to leave space, because I am treating that the same way as I am if I'm in line behind someone else. I don't want to be stuck, because a lot of times when the bike is pulling off is a great time for people to come from the back if they don't want to be in the back anymore. And I don't want to be stuck like, get out of my way, right? So I'm leaving that space to the bike. And a lot of times I see people at our track staying so close together, and that just doesn't give you a lot of options. So that's something I think that's important no matter where you are. Maybe not if you're in last place, because there's nobody coming from behind you and you're already pretty far back. But for most of the other positions, like at least having a half a wheel, right? Like it doesn't take very much to give you that exit out. So I think that that's really helpful. And then I guess, Andrew, you're going to talk a little bit about kind of specifically like front, middle, and back of the line.
Yeah, I generally break things down to like, am I 1 or 2? Am I 3 and 4? Or am I 5 and 6? And we'll start at the front. In a qualifying round, being 1 or 2 is fantastic, because as we talked about, usually 1 or 2 go through. As Kristen Walker once told me, you're already in a qualifying position. So why do you want to give that up? We've mentioned it already, that people will have to come around. They have to go the long way around. So that's already a benefit to being in the front. The worst thing to do if you're on the front is when the bike pulls off is to is to suddenly slow down. You've gotten all this free speed from the motor. Just keep it rolling. Yeah, you might technically slow down a couple miles an hour, but keep some pace in the pedals. And also make sure you're looking behind you and seeing what other people are doing, who's starting to move. There was one time when I was racing in Houston, and we had a former Japanese Kirin Pro who was not on good form race with us, and he led off from the bike, and he was able to control the entire field despite not having very good form, because he was so talented in how he raced it. And essentially what he did was, every time somebody started to poke their nose into the wind just a little bit, he'd just kick it, just half a pedal stroke, 1 pedal stroke. And suddenly everybody would just fall back into line, because, oh, he's accelerating. I don't want to burn all my energy when I'm in the wind. And that's like a great way to, hey, I'm on the front. I know I need to make it to, let's say 200 or 100, 250 meters to go before I can really accelerate and know I'm going to make it to the line. So if I every time I see somebody step out, just go a little bit faster. And then if somebody does really start to attack, start accelerating. Maybe you keep them on the hip. Maybe they start to come over the top and you can get their draft and then go around them again. So there are options there. If you see people start to come, then you go. But if not, just, keep the pace going, keep it moving up. If you're number 2, one of the best, and especially in a qualifier, one of the things I love to do is say, hey man, keep the speed up and I'll sweep your wheel. Because as we talked about, it's hard to go over the top. So at that point, you just feel free to be vocal to them. Hey, pick up the pace just a little bit more. Okay, they're starting to come, be vocal with the guy who maybe you're working with in the race, and just sit like right above the red line to make it very hard for everybody to come over the top. And maybe you'll go 1-2 and sweep through, and maybe you'll be the really bad friend going down the home straight and say, sorry, I got to qualify. But that's a legit strategy of like, hey, let's work a little bit together on this to make our way through.
Can I add one thing if you're at the front?
Yeah.
I think something that Andrew said that I think is really important is that you're keeping pressure on the pedals, but you don't have to keep going the speed that the bike was going, because that's hard sometimes. If it's a windy day or something and the bike pulls off and you try and keep that speed, that's hard. But if you just like tank and slow way down, then you kind of you leave more room for people to surprise you, right? But if you keep pressure on the pedals, then you're maintaining a speed that you can accelerate from, and you're less likely to be caught off guard, which I think happens to a lot of people. They're like, oh, it's really hard, the motor pulled off, I'm going to slow down, I don't want to waste any of my energy. But then you're going to have to re-accelerate, and in the bigger gears like we talked about, that takes a lot more out of you. So have the confidence to just like keep that pressure on the pedals without necessarily being like humping it hard, right? Like you're just kind of keeping it rolling comfortably. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so let's talk about like racing from the middle, 3 or 4, which are sometimes the best places to race from, but also can be the worst places to race from, because not only do you have people in front of you doing something, you have people behind you doing something. So you got to keep your head up as to what's going on in front of you, but also occasionally take a sneak look back to see what's going on behind you. So yeah, you have the benefit of a couple people drafting in front of you, but you also have people behind you. So it can be very easy if 5 and 6 decide to go, that suddenly you're boxed in down low with 4 people in front of you to come around. So making sure you keep a way out, riding maybe slightly higher than the rider in front of you, just so that you have a way to move out, is always good. But again, you're 3 and 4, you have the benefit of a draft. But if you're in a qualifying round, you're not in a qualifying position, especially in 4, usually in 3. So you got to make up that difference somewhere. So where is it going to be? 5 and 6 can be great spots to be, because you can see everything that's going on in front of you, but you have to get around them. On a track like Burnaby, if you're in 5 or 6, as soon as the bike pulls off, start moving up, or you don't have a prayer. On a track like ours, where we are a very open superhighway, start looking to see how other people are looking around. People a lot of times get very metronomic with their head. So if they're looking back and then looking forward, looking back and looking forward, time your attack when they're looking right before they start looking forward again. So then you're already up to speed and moving by the time they look back again. What else? Taylor, what else am I missing from the back?
I think that's pretty good. One thing that when you're saying this, it makes me think of a good thing to practice is that looking behind you at speed. Because kind of going back to the very beginning when we talked about if the Keirin is dangerous, some of the crashes that you see in the Keirin are from people going like moderate speed, looking behind them and running into the person in front of them, right? So practicing that awareness on the track is really important. That's what a lot of the Keirin is you kind of have to have that like sense of where people are without having to like turn and look for a really long time, because there's so much happening in such a short amount of time. So that's a good thing to practice when you're out at the track, even by yourself. Like when you're riding kind of fast, make sure that you can look around you and stay in a somewhat straight line, right? And then start getting more and more confident with that. Something from the back that I like to do is make sure that I'm moving up before the speed is too fast. So it's always easier. There's always going to be that little lull, right? Like, okay, 99% of the time there will be a little bit of a lull, right? And that is a really good time to move up. If you're trying to move up once the sprint has already started, or once people are already like starting to get antsy to get going, it becomes a lot harder to move even on our track, unless you're a lot faster than the people in your heat. So I'm looking for those tiny little lulls if I'm at the back to make that move up. And there's often room to move up going underneath. So you guys have probably seen it before where there's this big like fan up and you can see someone kind of sneak underneath to move up. So you're looking for those type of opportunities also when you're in that like 5th and 6th position.
Yeah, there's a great question about leaving a gap to the motor and attacking through. Is that a good idea? It can be, at least to help maintain your speed, taking a run at the bike for sure. However, that's a match that you're going to burn. So, if you're more of the endurance persuasion and you got a bunch of sprinters on your wheel, unless you're probably Ashton Lambie, who's able to do a sub 4-minute pursuit, you got to be able to keep that pace up as the accelerations start to happen. So, it's not, feel free to try it, but if you start going full gas, it's 600 meters out, you're probably going to start to fade to the end and people are going to probably start to come around.
And everybody can see you doing that if you're at the
Yes.
front. So it's a lot harder to you're not surprising someone. So unless your jump is phenomenal, right? And they're all not paying attention at all, it's going to be hard to get enough of a gap to make that worth it. Like Andrew said, that's a really long time for anybody to sprint for, even if you're an endurance rider, right? Like you can't go for a lap and a half full gas.
Yeah. Question for Billy. What are the most common official calls we see in the Keirin? Essentially, what should I not do?
Well, the headbutting and jostling's one of them. I mean, the rules specify the race shall be stopped and the offending miscreant will be removed. But we don't normally try to stop the races. It's a disadvantage. So you usually get a warning or you could get a disqualification. That's not really a common one. The most common one is the move coming through turn 3 to 4, in which somebody is back in the third, fourth position, trying to get qualified, maybe to go to final, and they move up coming out of turn 4 and impede the other rider on their hip. That's the most common one. It's not keeping your lane. That's what we call most often. Really the rest of them, and I will knock on wood, but last year was a fairly safe year for the Keirins. That was great. A lot of people paid attention and were watching where they're moving, but yeah, moving out of your lane. The other one would be that coming into the lane, if you're coming over someone, entering the lane while it's occupied, not giving that gap there when you come back down in the sprint lane.
All right. And one last thing on our questions before we want to get to doing some video before it gets too late is, what are the reasons I should move my place before the bike pulls off? That's a great question that we've kind of been asked a couple times. Andy asked it before we got started here. And to be honest, in the whole time I've been racing at Marymore, I've moved up once, and it was because I think I was dead last. Everybody started riding really high, and kind of what Taylor alluded to is I just shot the gap underneath and then pushed that person who was 5th back to 6th. So, being able to change your position to your advantage is probably the best case. If let's say there's a really good sprinter whose wheel you want to be on and you have the opportunity to be on their wheel by moving up, go for it. But mostly, if you get out of the line of draft, you're going to be pushing through a lot of wind and burning some matches to do it. So if you're doing it, make sure you're really able to fight for position and able to get the spot you need to get. The other thing I guess you could do is if you're at the very back and you're more of the endurance persuasion, you can take the run as soon as the bike starts to pull off. You can take the run and try to get a jump on the whole field, maybe establish that 10, 15 meter gap and hold it all the way through.
Yeah, I would say for me, it's usually not worth the effort to do that reshuffling. That seems to me, I'm trying to be as relaxed as I possibly can, and doing that always seems a little stressful to me. I think I've done it a few times, kind of like what Andrew just talked about, where, oh, okay, somebody just opened this perfect spot, I'll slide right in there, but I'm not swinging out to get back in. Maybe if I really want to put some people between me and someone else, that would be a time. So a lot of times, if maybe there's one really fast person, yourself, and then maybe 2 really slow people, it'd be nice to have those 2 slow people between you and that fast person, right? And so trying to maybe do that. But for me, most of the time, it's not worth that effort to do it when the bike is still there. I might try and shuffle my position immediately after the bike pulls off, when there's that lull that we talked about. But, I think it's not worth it most of the time.
All right. Any other quick strategy questions before we start moving into watching some videos?
Andy Baker had one. I know we usually have 6 people, but sometimes it's 8. It's 8. If I draw a 7 or 8, should I move up to 2 or 3 while the bike is still out?
if you have the opportunity, I'd say go for it, because that's definitely usually we're going to run that many people, probably most likely in like a qualifying situation rather than like a final. So, if you have that opportunity to move up, go for it. If not, know that you're probably going to have to move earlier, because if 2 and 3 start sprinting and you're still back in 7th, you have to make up all that gap that they're starting up. So usually the further back you are, the quicker you have to start making your move. And kind of something that we talked about in the training section is making a move doesn't necessarily have to be an all-out effort. It can be a 95% effort to get you in a good position. Maybe get on somebody's hip, kind of keep them down low. And then when we hit the back straight, go for it, give everything you can. And then, try to take the front, or at least if you generally, especially on our track, if you can stay on somebody's wheel through 3 or right on somebody's hip through 3 and 4, you're going to be faster than them as soon as you hit the home straight. So even if you're just going all out to stay right on their wheel, you come down to 4 and then it's a straight shot to the line.
Something I would argue is that some people do need to go 100% to get to the position that they need to be in. And sometimes that is your race. And so people are a little hesitant to go that hard. But sometimes if you're in 7th or 8th, or you're at the way back and you're trying to get to the front, your race is to get to the front. If you don't get to the front, you're going to end up, 6th maybe, right? So you have to kind of commit to that move. A good time, coming out of turn 4 to get to the front before the bell's ringing, right? You don't have to keep going 100% when you get to the front, right? That's a common thing. I think people start going that far out, and that's a really long time to go that far out. But your move is to get to the front, and then you can chill a little bit for the next move of the finish. Do you agree with that, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that's right. I was kind of looking at some of the questions in chat, but yeah, I think you're pretty spot on. Billy, how much pressure are we allowed to put on people to get certain positions behind the bike, or even to get the motor?
Yeah, I saw that. So once you're past, and I'm going to say the 1 lap distance, if we agree on the half lap distance, the half lap, as long as you're not making a move where you're going to create a dangerous situation, you could probably ride up next to him, overtake him by a bit, and sort of stick your hip out and see if they back off. I was always, my younger years, person of intimidation. Let's see how much I could get away with, So again, you could test it and push the envelope and see what the officials call on it. Officials read the race differently depending on the official. We have the rules, but we all have different interpretations of whether you're dancing the line on the red line or you're really pushing in and you're trying to occupy the lane, trying to take over the lane while it's occupied.
Andy, there's your next level strategy of planning your Keirin moves based on who the officials are.
I was going to say that has definitely been something I have done in the past. Yeah. Because you do kind of know when someone, like, let's say you're racing in T-Town, you can get away with a lot more than you can get away with at other tracks. And so you kind of know that. I always say you have to really know the rules before you can break them. So you have to make sure that you really understand and are very aware of what you can and cannot do and what you might get called for. And there's also ways to do that without it looking as bad, right? If you're chopping someone and making it really big and aggressive, you're more likely to get called for that, right? But if you are kind of easing your way in front of them and you make it look really smooth and it doesn't look as aggressive, you might get away with that more. But back to, you really have to know the rules before you can break them. And you really have to make sure that you are in really good control of your bike and your handling, and that those kind of moves are safe that you're doing, right? That you're in control. You're not just like aggressively chopping someone.
Yeah. As soon as you start to put people in danger, you're most likely going to get called for it. If you're just being a very aggressive but safe rider, it's probably going to go okay. Lee asked real quick, is there an aerodynamic deficit to pulling up and riding next to position 1? Yeah, I mean, you're going to be braking. You're probably going to get a little bit of aerodynamic help than just being like straight off the front because you're riding next to somebody. But keep in mind that now you have a double pace line forming behind you. So the people behind you are really getting an aerodynamic benefit of 2 people riding right next to each other.
I also always think about like, why am I doing that? Right? Like, why would I just ride up next to someone and waste that energy? Like, make sure that when you're doing something, there's a reason for it, because sometimes it's worth that energy and sometimes it's not.
Is it true officials will infer intent from a dropped shoulder if bumped with a helmet? Don't think so. Okay, let's get into some videos. All right, Taylor, how are we just going to watch somebody in this one, or just let it play out and see what people think?
Let's watch Emmett. So Emmett's right here. I can't point, but he's behind the bike. So we're not going to tell you what we see, but let's watch and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
Martinez. Rounding out the group is Eric Waterman in the pink. And as the moto leaves the way, it will be Haldeman that picks up the speed. Holly's come out of turn 4 and at the front of the field is getting the bell. Mike Robson on his wheel. Waterman accelerating nicely. Carlberg positioning himself. He wants to be on that third wheel, second wheel, whoever's going to come around in the turn 2 here so he can launch his own attacks. It'll be Robson, and on his wheel is Carlberg right where he wants to be. With him is a challenger as well. Going to be Martinez trying to find his own room around the right-hand side. Waterman's down in that sprinter's lane. Will he have room down there, though? He can't really maneuver. He has to be in the top 3. Martinez is going to be the problem here. It's going to be Carlberg, Robson. Oh, Carlberg. It's going to be Martinez, and I think Robson on the sprinter's lane unofficially, as I think it wasn't quite enough room for Waterman.
All right. What did we see there? So it's going to get a little hard now that we're just going through chat. Blue shirt pushed too early and wasn't able to sustain power. Yeah, yep. Haldy does that. That's a Haldy move, but it's going to the front and seeing what happens. You know, that's a strategy. We were watching Emmett, and we'll back up and let's go through what Emmett does. So we see here that Emmett is on the wheel, or Emmett is. I'm content on Robson's wheel because he's a good wheel to follow and he's going quick enough. So we get to a really interesting phase, especially in a qualifying heat, where as soon as we hit the front straight, Mike and I know we're pretty much through and we start to back off the gas a little bit. And that creates this huge wall that then Emmett has to go around and he's not able to. So, you know, this is some of the stuff we talked about of you don't necessarily want to give up the first position because now everybody started to accelerate. He had to make his way across a big wall. And then because it's just a qualifier, we kind of all started to turn off the gas on the home straight. And that's a much bigger, harder gap to close down because you have to go really high.
There's a lot of complaints about collusion. Yeah.
When you're wearing Texas Roadhouse kits, both your names are Carlson. It's pretty much the only times I've seen collusion.
Yes, I would say this, yeah. This happens a lot in Keirin's, especially in early rounds, though. It's not necessarily collusion as, okay, well, I did all I had to do to get through. I am not worried about anyone else. So that's that wall that Andrew's talking about. Yeah, maybe in this instance there is some, but in general, you'll see that happen a lot. So yes, it is a qualifying heat, but especially if you're not one of the strongest riders in the field, you need to treat that like a final. So that means you should be racing to get to the front, not necessarily relying on other people. Because unless you're, you know, like maybe for Andrew, he was pretty confident in this heat that he was going to be able to qualify through, but maybe someone else should have done something a little bit more proactive to try and kind of have a better shot of that. Right.
And I think Mike Robson in the blue jersey definitely did that of, you know, he took the opportunity with Haldy's acceleration to move to the front. And then he just was, you know, the old when in doubt, lead it out. And just, you know, if everybody came over the top, everybody came over the top, but he put himself in a really good position all the way through to be able to snag a qualifying position in that case. And as far as collusion goes, especially like in a qualifying round, it's going to be very hard for somebody to say, oh, you know, he led somebody out when it's like, well, you know, no, I was just I had to save energy for the finals. You know, that's sometimes an excuse, sometimes the truth. So, you know, it's definitely hard to play out of, of where that collusion line is going to be. If it's super obvious, it's probably going to get called. But even then, as we kind of talked about in strategy, 1 and 2 can look at each other and say, hey, let's work a little bit together to make sure we both go through. And that's going to be very hard collusion to call, because we're just racers talking about things. And it's not like the fix was really in that much ahead of time. And then we still had to do all the work to get there.
Andy's asking in the chat about what Emmett could have done. It's easy to maybe get suckered into wanting to follow that fast person in the heat. One thing I would say with how he raced that, he still could have had a chance to follow Andrew when Andrew started going, but he wasn't going fast enough. He was still kind of going backwards. Something that I like to think about if there's someone faster than me is that I already need to be going like 100% just to get on their wheel. So like if I'm racing in the men's field, for example, their top speed is a lot faster than mine. So I'm like going full gas just to try and get on a wheel. Because if you get on the wheel, you might have a chance to getting towed up and around. But if you are sitting waiting for that wheel to come by you, it's coming by so much faster that you have no chance to get on at that point, especially if you're not the faster rider. So I think that Emmett in this race, he's going backwards right here where Andrew has it. He's still going to the back, and Andrew is already starting to pick up the speed, and Emmett needs to be going like his 100% probably at this point just to try and get on Andrew's wheel, and then he might have gotten towed around, but he just never got on that tow, right?
Yeah, if we look at it from right here, like it's a little bit hard to tell depth, but if the rider in the dark blue sleeves, if they were already on the gas as the guys in the white jerseys, myself being the leading one, as we start to accelerate, then because look, yeah, he's right on my wheel right there. And as I'm accelerating and going forward, by the time we cross the finish line and we get here, that's a 2 bike length gap that he could have been on my wheel on. And instead, Nick starts to take that space. Nick being the other white and blue skin suit. All right, let's move on to another video. Let's see what we got here. I think Nolan, who's in the black and pink here, I think he does a really good job being opportunistic in this race to move on. So let's watch what Nolan does specifically. Again, he's the black and pink rider.
I've seen him in a number of sprint tournaments. He's a fast rider, and he does not want that front position. Pulls up quickly, giving room for now Nolan Adams to reposition himself. The field's starting to move around a little bit. It's going to be Darlene. Percentage Cycles wants to make a move at 1 to go. Carlberg followed his wheel up and through the field. Bib number 1, known as a top speed finisher around here. So he's trying to show that off here in the Kieran. McLaughlin says, I can try to match that speed. I'll do what I can down the back straight. Nolan Adams also lined up. It's going to be the top 2. Here we go. Carlberg, McLaughlin, Adams. Whoa, coming to the turn. It's looking pretty crazy here. Carlberg. I think McLaughlin might have found that one unofficially.
So if we look back at like that one, Nolan, Steven, who's in the black and checkers there, right as the bike pulls off, Steven decides to go up, probably looking to see what I'm going to do or what somebody else is going to do. And Nolan keeps it very cool and just keeps the pace going, and this is what we talked about of, okay, he suddenly found himself on the front, he kept the pace up. So at that point in time, when the moves start to happen, Mike Darlene, who's in the dark blue kit from the back, realizes, oh, it's a great time to move up to try to get himself into a qualifying position. And, Nolan does a really good job here of seeing the wave coming. Nolan in the black and pink does a really good job of seeing the moves coming and start to accelerate and gets on our wheels, kind of exactly what Taylor was just talking about, so that he's in a great position. And I believe McLaughlin actually gets relegated in this race. So Steven goes through, or so Nolan goes through.
I really like how Mike in the blue, the dark blue and the light blue used that lull and fully committed to getting all the way around everyone. You can see he pretty much dies out coming out of turn 2. So something that could have helped him potentially after he got to the front is to chill for just a little bit, because you always need to be ready for that next acceleration down the back straightaway. And he kind of continued all the way through turns 1, 2.
So the move there in turn 4 by McLaughlin, where he probably was not totally intentionally trying to take Nolan out of the picture, but right there, he definitely impeded coming up on the rider, endangering the rider, and also impeding the sprint, mainly impeding the sprint. So that's a call that we made. Actually, Dot and I made the call from the stand. James was turned a little bit, and he had his something was wrong with his radio. So it took about a few minutes to get the call down to up to Corey.
Yeah. And as we've talked about before, of like, once you get up to top, everybody gets up to top speed, especially when you have like myself and Steven in the race, like we are people who train to be sprinters. So once we get up to top speed, it's going to be much harder for anybody else coming around. And you can see the rider in green and the rider with the purple shorts on, they're doing everything they can, but really aren't making much headway as we come to the finish line. So, that's one of those, moving early is better than moving late per se, because then you get caught behind everybody trying to go really fast rather than making us have to go around you. Anybody have anything else they want to talk about with this race?
I think you're good to move on.
Cool. Let's see what else we got here. Oh yeah, we got this one. So this is what we talked about with leading from the front, and we have 2 videos back to back that really talk about leading from the front. The second one's a little bit better than the first one, but the quality is better on the first one. So we'll start here. And this is Carl, one of our JB juniors in the black and blue kit, and he is leading this minor final out from the front.
He will maintain speed, but he is not working too hard. In fact, he slows it off just a bit. The rest of the field starts to fan out a little bit as they hit corner 4. Martinez starting to reposition. So is Williams. The acceleration not yet coming at 1 to go. The bell's ringing. Now Martinez starting to pick up the pace a little bit. Paul Paredes is waiting to see something. He sees Martinez coming into view, so now he's just going to try to sprint this thing up in the front. Martinez making a good run at him, the rider for the Pipe Broadmark team in the white and blue. Here he goes down through turn 3. It's still a good acceleration for Martinez. Making a good run at it. Kenny Williams also on the wheel, maybe able to come around the outside. It's 3 riders near the front. It's going to be Martinez. Martinez all the way around the track, number 8.
So in that race, the rider who was on the front, Carl, did a really great job of, kind of looking back, seeing where things go. And then when the wave started to come, accelerating and trying to keep Nick up on his hip. Sadly, Nick had a little bit more legs to him than Carl did, but Carl did a very good job of trying to ride that from the front.
Something I like to do at the front sometimes is get out of my saddle and not really actually accelerate, because I think that's a good way to kind of fake that you're speeding up. And that's sometimes enough to discourage people to come around you. It makes you a little bigger, a little harder to go around. So you don't necessarily always have to be like speeding up when you get out of the saddle.
It's a very good point. I'm sure we'll see that in the next video.
As the pacer pulls out of the way, she'll immediately do what a lot of these riders do in the Keirin, a little bit.
So real quick, this is from the 2019 Grand Prix, and this is Maddie Godby, who went to the Tokyo Olympics, and she is on the front in this Keirin of a decently stacked women's field too. So, it's not just that she's an amazing bike rider, but there are some other amazing bike riders in this field as well.
Off the pace and watching the right shoulder. Who's going to go? Who's going to go? I don't want to start this thing. Do you want to start this thing? Somebody's going to go at some point. Start to bunch up a little bit in turn 4. Godby still watching for the action. McKenna McKee also keeping her eyes open. 1 to go. 1 to go. Godby is really trying to watch for the movement behind her. We're still waiting for somebody to take some kind of action here. It'll be McKee that does the first leap. She's up and out of that saddle trying to drive this thing. Godby says, I don't think you can come around me. I got this speed all taken care of, but look out for the Australian also trying to get in the mix. Lizanne Fox has got some speed here in the Keirin. Godby, Fox, Godby will do it.
Taylor, you want to talk us through that one?
I was just going to say at the very end there, I like that Lizanne goes underneath when she's kind of sneaking her way through, because the McKenna was trying to come up and around and went pretty wide on her pass. And so it left a perfect gap through underneath for Lizanne to pop out to come up next to Maddie. Something that I really like from the front is that you are in control of the speed, and you can really see Maddie doing that for this whole ride. You see her get out of the saddle a couple times. She picks up the pace when she needs to. And it's also kind of keeping everyone else a little bit nervous, waiting for her to open it up. You see the bunch kind of behind her because no one else is willing to commit. I think that would have been a great opportunity for someone like Elspeth, who, I think she was 6th in line at the beginning. I think she should have tried to get to the front, but I think a lot of times when there's someone like Maddie in the field, people are willing to just like wait for that. And we talked about this earlier, that it's a good to try something. Like if you're just like, oh, I'm here, I'm lucky to be in the final, like try and do something, because what's the worst that can happen? You might still get 6th, but at least you tried to go to the front, right?
That's actually a great segue into one of the videos Lizanne was happy enough to share with us from New South Wales in the state champs. And I think Lizanne is second wheel at this point. But essentially, in her own words, I didn't know how to race a Keirin and almost beat somebody who was really fast. So essentially, because she wasn't intimidated by the presence of somebody else, she wasn't waiting to see what happened. She was willing just to take the race by whatever happened, and ended up almost beating somebody who's really good. It was a good race.
There's a couple like obvious things that we just talked about, but something I did want to point out in that video is the pass at the end. Because a lot of times I think, especially when you're closing down a big gap, you're just like trying so hard to get to that person in front of you. And we almost forget that we're actually trying to pass them. If you watch when she passes, there's no hesitation. It is straight like through that rider, right? So watch that. She's catching and she's going right around her. She's not losing any of that momentum that she has. And so I think that's something that's just a good reminder with racing in general. Like if you're trying to beat someone, you're not just trying to get to them, you're trying to get in front of them. So racing through that person, right? I really liked that pass, but Lizanne took the like perfect opportunity. Everyone's looking around and then fully committed to the move when she went. And maybe that's because she didn't know what she was doing. I know she's on this call. Maybe that's because she said she didn't know what she was doing. So it's easier sometimes to fully commit to that. But I think that's a good like go for it, right? And it almost worked out for her in this race.
Let's get another one from Lizanne, because she has some good on the bike perspectives as well. This one, I believe, riding from the front. And you can tell she's keeping it pretty steady, but also, we can't see her head, but I assume she's looking back and what's going on. She's also riding right on the red there, which is great because it makes, if people are going to start to pass, they have to go high. It's similar to when you're racing a match sprint of make the person go the distance you can. They have to, or the most distance you can. So when she gets into the corner, she's going up to the red. And again, you can tell that she's just riding tempo and slowly increasing the pace until it's launch time.
I also like to ride not a perfectly straight line when I'm at the front because it makes it harder to pass, right? You're not like zigzagging all over the track, but you're kind of like having a little bit of flow to what you're doing, which you can see in this view pretty well. It just makes it a little more intimidating because you can't quite tell how to line that person up in front of you.
Let's see what else we got from, we got this one from some Group B Keirin finals at our carnival. Let's see what happens here.
be saying goodbye to Jack and the pacing efforts as he turns left. And now Andrew Martin waits for something to happen as he pulls up right and allows anyone else to come up to the front. And that person is going to be Eric Waterman for the Dixie Flyer Orange team. As Vern Cole looks on in anticipation as his teammate gets the bell and he's up the lead. The bell ringing, the sprint far from engaged here. Still waiting for the speed to come from the group. As we go down the back straight, it's still Waterman playing the guard dog at the front. Bobby Walthar, though, is going to take the first bite out of this one as he makes the big jump up. He'll now take the lead spot by about half a bike as he's going to make it tough on Brett Walker to try to jump back up on this one. Bobby at the front, still hold on. Brett Walker coming in hot. It's Bobby, Brett, and then Andrew Martin. Go 1, 2, 3. That's going to be 7 points for the.
Taylor, what do we see? Anything interesting?
I think nobody in this field is like a true pure sprinter, so it kind of changes the dynamic a little bit. I don't know. What do you want to call out on this one?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think Eric did a really good job of taking the front opportunity when he had it, rather than just, kind of sitting up with everybody else.
I'm not a fan of the. I don't want to like diss our track, but a lot of people pull off the front when the motor pulls off here, and I think that hopefully that changes. Maybe some people that are on this call, because it is better to make people come around you. And when you pull off the front, all of a sudden you've given up that position. And so have a little bit of confidence. You don't have to keep going 100%. One of my favorite things, if I'm at the front, is to let one person come in front of me. And so you can kind of make that happen. Like people start coming, you speed up a little and you let one person in front of you. And then all of a sudden you have a lead out. You're not leading it out yourself, but you didn't pull off the front to get that, right?
Yeah. Andy had a really great comment in chat of, we saw 2 people pull off the front and neither of them won. There's one other really good Lizanne video I want to share before we probably try to wrap this up. And Lizanne is third at this point as the bike is coming off. And in this video, she does a very good job of kind of following the right people and not moving moving at the right times to the right places. And as Lizanne points out in the chat, all she had to do was qualify third to go through to the major final. So she was happy to sit in the draft, follow the wheels where she needed to do, and make sure she secures her position. The one thing I will say is, if sometimes I found out in my own personal experience, if I race for third, I get fourth. So, that can be a dangerous move to play. I'd rather burn just a small extra couple watts to make sure I go through, rather than playing it very close. But if you're as confident as Lizanne is, it can also pay off to be patient. I think there was a really good bit here. Was it further back? It was further back, where instead of, as she got flicked, or the rider behind her was kind of or in front of her was kind of moving her high, and she decided to go low and gain some advantage and some draft and have to go less distance. And I thought that was a really good move. All right, well, it's 8:45, and this has been a very fun hour and 15 minutes of talking about Keirin's. Is there any final questions that people have before we call it a night? Taylor, any final thoughts while we wait for some questions?
Oh, Andy has a question.
Oh, Kieran's toe straps and shoe covers. If I had to pick one, I'd take my toe straps over the shoe covers, just because, you never know if you're, as Tyler, if you're lucky enough to have somebody to help you out, totally run both, but, don't delay our program just for the sakes of vanity. That's all I would say. Keith's going very old school of toe straps and no socks. That's a look. But yeah, toe straps are very common in Kieran's, just for the nature of, it really helps keep that foot bound very tightly to the pedal so you can get all the power out you need to get. It's not necessarily about making sure you don't come unclipped, although that is a benefit. But it's really about taking that any sort of kind of float you have between the pedal, shoe, and even foot in shoe, and really getting that out of the system. Andy, you get low enough on that Pinarello, you're plenty aero.
If you're not a sprinter, is there things you can do to like have those really quick acceleration in a race like the Keirin? Just move early. I don't know. I'd just like to hear your guys' perspective on it.
I think that kind of comes back to what we talked about at the beginning about racing to your strengths. So if you know that you're not like super snappy, that probably means that the sprint needs to be a bit longer for you. So initiating the sprint or trying to encourage somebody else to initiate it. That doesn't mean you have to lead it out, but a lot of times if you kind of start going, that encourages someone else to go, and that takes away some of the snappiness. The nice thing I think about the Keirin is that the speeds are already pretty high because of the motor, so it takes away some of that snap that you might get like in a match sprint with a pure sprinter. And so it can be a race for someone who isn't necessarily a pure sprinter, right? Like you just have to race to the best of your strengths, right? And get the speed up a little higher. You wouldn't be the person that would want it to slow way down after the motor pulls off, because then that leaves it open for 5 other people to surprise you with a jump. So I think it's just about kind of knowing what you're good at, and then making a plan. We talked about that at the beginning too, like going into it with a plan. Like if the sprint hasn't started by X point on the track, I know I need to be going. So no matter what's happening, I'm going to go at that point, right? And I think sometimes that's a good, like when you're first starting, I don't know if we fully talked about this, but like give yourself a point on the track that no matter what's going on, you need to be at max speed at that point. So you got to do whatever you can to get to max speed by that point.
And I would just also add that, we spent a lot of time focusing on Keirin's here, but track racers as a whole are generally a little bit more quick twitchy than our road or cyclocross or mountain counterparts. So, we're talking a lot about Keirin's, but a lot of scratch races end in sprints. In a points race, there's a bunch of sprints. It's not always going to come out of a breakaway. So, spending some time training a little bit of quick twitch to be able to get that acceleration in gaps where you need is not a bad thing. Even if you're, fully committed to going for a points race, you're going to need to know how to sprint to win a points race.
And you have to be able to go fast enough to get off the front. So if your mode is to go off the front of a race, you still have to be able to accelerate fast enough to get away from people, right? So it's a benefit even if you don't see yourself at all as a sprinter. You still got to have a little bit of that.
Would our Cat 3 Keirins be better if the bike came off at 400? I don't think so. I think a lot of times it's, especially if you think about most of the Cat 3s, maybe some of them have just come out of the Cat 4s where they're having to pick their own gears for the first time. Some are still trying to figure out what kind of riders they are. So, and you're also, as a Cat 3, probably still learning how to race the races, especially in an ungear restricted fashion. So, I think a lot of things, it's just, some practice you see some Cat 3s who know what they're doing race better at Keirin's because they've done more of them. So, things like this, or we've talked about, what to do, where to do. Hopefully we see some better Cat 3 Keirins, but I don't think, 400 meters is the answer. I think learning how to race the race better is the answer. As riders are using progressively bigger gears, as Keirin's success is more about muscle strength and leg speed in years past. Yes, with an asterisk, because you still need to be like, nobody's winning a Keirin at the high level at 108 RPM. They're still hitting 130, 140 RPM. We've just found out that everything works better at that RPM with bigger gears, and bigger gears, you can still hit those big RPMs. So, it's still important to have that strength and leg speed equivalent, because if you don't know how to ride smoothly at 140 RPM, you're not going to be able to put out good power at 140 RPM. So being able to do max leg speed efforts, even if the sprints aren't at 180 RPMs anymore, are still important, so you know how to control your bike at 140 RPM. Tyler's a big fan of the slow twitch gang. Good luck on your hour record, Tyler. I would be more concerned that when the moto drops off late, people try and accelerate and Reed push others up the track to the finish line at 400. Yeah, that would probably be a concern. Yeah, I would agree. Any other final questions, or should we call it a night? Cool. Well, thank you all for joining us on this this Sunday evening. I hope you learned something. It was definitely a lot of fun to host. Jane, thanks for putting this together from the development perspective. If you have some feedback on this session, please feel free to reach out to us one way or the other. Jane, are you development@velodrome.org?
I'm
info@velodrome.org. So if you want to reach out to Jane and thank Jane for putting this together and how it's all going, and any feedback on the session or any idea of what we should do next if we want to do one of these, info@velodrome.org is a great way to do it. I'm sure Amara also has an email address out there. It's probably amara@velodrome.org. I'm sure you can find us on our website. So if you have any feedback for us on this session, you have ideas for other sessions we should do, yeah, please let us know. And thank you all for coming.